some of the different types of CSS that we might see in a project. This is stuff that I've copied and pasted from the Shopify project. Some people like this approach, where they have what they call utility classes or helper classes that you can drop in pretty much anywhere on your project. You can mix them together, kind of like Lego blocks. The part about this that scares me is a couple things. One, naming convention, like if I see SS or PP in my HTML, do I know what that means? I have to go back here and go, oh, S, oh, that probably means spacing. Okay, I get it, right? Like, it's so brief that it's kind of hard to understand unless you actually know the code base, that you've been playing with it every day. And when you're a developer who doesn't really know CSS, a lot of this ends up going over their heads. And so the other thing I don't like about this is that this feels like an abstraction of inline styles. I mean, I think as an industry, we've kind of come to the conclusion that inline styles are bad. And therefore, I'm not going to put margin 10 pixels right in my CSS. But I might have a bunch of other CSS that might be applying to this element. And therefore, I'm going to put this in my CSS and do bang important. Right? Like, I will guarantee that this will work in all likelihood. But this, has a lot of failings. Now, what's interesting is that I, having worked at Yahoo, was not the only, sort of voice of reason. There's a number of different approaches. A coworker of mine at the time, their projects that they were building, they did take this approach. This is the naming convention that they used on their projects. He even wrote up an article on SMACSS magazine to describe this process, having these utility classes and essentially mixing these things together. So BFC, which is a new block formatting context, that you've got margins, you've got floats, but again, these like really short class names are kind of confusing and hard to understand, and to me aren't a whole lot better than inline styles. We might have CSS that looks like this. When I look at this, I can almost guarantee that they use a preprocessor. And there's a lot of HTML that needs to exist for this CSS to work. Like, there has to be that layout _1_2, probably a div, inside of another div, inside of another div, inside of another div. And what's interesting is that the thing here that we're trying to style is the thing on the end. I care what the status bar looks like. I care what the status looks like. I care what the link in the status looks like. And so we've created all this extra CSS that is a little superfluous, right? It's a little extraneous to what we're actually trying to style. This that I took from the Drupal website. This example that I had taken from the Drupal website is an example where they had this navigation. They had it in two different places. They had the header nav and they had this content nav, but they repeated the styles in each place. Now again, there are some advantages to this. I can modify the look and feel of my header navigation and not break the other navigation. But at the same time, I'm not reusing code, right? That if you could imagine, as a site gets more and more complex, the more and more code I'm going to have to write. I'm not reusing existing patterns. And therefore, my code base is just going to get larger and harder to manage. It's going to be more difficult for me to say, change the design of all navigation or change all buttons. If I have each one look very similarly, but be in different places and therefore have different CSS just because they exist in different places. And so, like I said, my site is 5 years old. This is the CSS from my own website. I have no idea why I made it this complex. Why do I have these long selectors? How many author names do I have to style on my site? Well, these are for comments. I don't have a lot of different comment systems. I have one. And so I created this rather complex CSS that didn't need to be there. It's funny to actually kind of go back and actually modify my CSS to make it simpler and realize how much extra code I put in there for absolutely no reason. Because again, what I cared about is I cared what the comment number looked like, and I cared about what the author name looked like. This was the important stuff that I was trying to style. Everything else was just extraneous. So when I was at Yahoo and really thinking through, okay, what are the problems that I'm running into and how are other people solving this? I started doing some research. Unfortunately, not a lot of people at the time were really talking about scalable CSS. How do you work on a project that can grow, not only from the code base perspective, but also team perspective. And so Nicole Sullivan's object-oriented CSS was, and a lot of her talks were one of the few things out there that really talked about these types of systems. She used to work at Yahoo as well. It's funny how we kind of see the same things over and over again. I took a look at Jeremy Keith's pattern primer. He had been talking a little bit about this tool that he had built. Natalie Down had a presentation called Practical Maintainable CSS. And it's interesting, I actually just this week went back to look over that presentation again and saw a lot of the similar elements that I talk about now in that presentation. That was over 3 years ago. Gina Bolton has a presentation on CSS workflow. And I took a look at all these different things and really brought them in and thought about, okay, what is it I'm building and why am I building it this way? So I mentioned Shopify's CSS. This looks a little redacted, but in this case, really trying to look at, our entire code base. Now, this isn't a post-compilation CSS file. When I started, it was a single CSS file, this long, stretchy thing. And each time a designer worked on a project, they would write their CSS and add it to the bottom of this list. It became like a tree, right? When you cut the tree and you can see all the different rings. And that's what this became. I could see new code versus old code, and the further down I got, the newer it became. I know a lot of people will say a CSS preprocessor will solve your architectural problems. Guess what? We used SMACSS, a preprocessor, to build this. This was a SASS file. I mean, it was one big SASS file. But that's not what we wanted. Because when we're working with CSS like this, we change something in one place, it breaks in another place. It becomes this kind of really convoluted mess and difficult to maintain. It becomes frustrating, right? This is kind of how I feel. So thankfully, the work we've managed to do at Shopify now looks a little bit more like this. Modularization, we've been able to take all these components and actually use a lot of the great features of our preprocessor to make our CSS more manageable. So what is SMACSS? Talking about scalable and modular architecture, there's a few different components to it. One is categorization. We're writing CSS, we're creating these rules in our CSS for a reason. What are those reasons? And that's what the categorization is about. It's about naming convention. Why are we naming things the way they are? How do we separate things between things? When I first wrote SMACSS, categorization to me was like the foundation. It was the critical thing that really explained what SMACSS was all about. That by separating the different types of CSS that we write, we would create better CSS. And what's interesting is that over the last 3 years, I've recognized that naming convention, more than anything, is actually the most important thing. Because it clarifies our intent in a number of different areas. It allows us to recognize when things belong together and when they don't. SMACSS is about decoupling CSS from HTML. That might seem like a bit of a weird statement. CSS is designed to style HTML, but there's a lot of things from the cascade that can actually make our lives more difficult. So how can we mitigate those types of issues? How can we avoid those kind of problems that we run into when we have a bunch of different styles in multiple places of our CSS trying to style the same thing? those are the problems that tend to crop up where we start having to throw more selectors at it, or we have to throw bang important at it in order to get around those kind of problems. And the last thing I'll be touching on is about state-based design. And state-based design for me is really just a reflection of how I look at building a web page. So taking the components that I have and how do they exist in different states.